atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay. So, I think we can just get right to it. There were a bunch of things we didn't have time to get to. Not surprisingly, we spent a lot of time, especially on the Claudine Gay story, but the other things as well. So,
which is weird. It's we sort of fall into the Harvard trap as well. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You can't. Yes.
Frustrating to me, right? Because I actually did this a while back. I looked at or tried to find as many of the college affiliations of the journalists at, or the, what do you call, media personalities at like Fox and MSNBC and New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And as you would expect, just chock full of Ivy League. And I guess maybe it's because I'm not that person, right? I have no real ties with the sort of Eastern elite establishment that it rankles, a little bit, right? There are plenty of incredibly intelligent, impressive people who went to Baldwin Wallace University or the Ohio State University and yet Harvard punches so much above it. I guess maybe not above its economic weight, but anyway, maybe that's just me being a bitter flyover country person. I don't know.
Well, no, I think, quite honestly, I do think there was an anti-East Coast elitism vein that kind of runs through what we do, right? I mean, again, just because of our Midwestern sort of, I don't know, I call it this, they phrase Jerry Ford, Midwestern decency.
There you go. I like that. I'll go.
Yeah. The sensibility that you and I kind of just were brought up in, and I think that's part of the perspective that we bring. That maybe people, again, I'm certainly people on the West Coast, people on the East Coast, see things much differently. But
yes, our good solid
what I'm saying is I'm proud to represent.
There you go. Absolutely,
represent the 216.
Absolutely, and the 513 in my case. But anyway, yeah. Let's get to some of those stories we weren't able to. And one is actually fairly recent. It's raised some bipartisan concern. Nippon Steel, which is the largest steel maker in Japan, fourth largest in the world, recently agreed to acquire U.S. Steel for $14.9 billion. And that was nearly double the $7.3 billion offered this summer by U.S. steelmaker Cleveland-Cliffs. Now, the Biden administration has said that the planned purchase deserves serious scrutiny because of possible national security and supply chain concerns. And both U.S. Steel and Nippon have said that they expect the Committee on Foreign Investment to review the pending sale, but they feel fairly confident that it will be approved. And I mentioned there's a fair amount of bipartisan opposition. Republican Senators J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, as well as Democrats like Sherrod Brown, Joe Manchin, John Fetterman have come out against it. But it looks like, at least at this point, that there probably won't be enough opposition to prevent the deal from going through. Now, if we take a look at former Trump administration trade officials who probably would play some role in a future Trump administration if he ends up winning in 2024, you have former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. He argued in a Wall Street Journal editorial that opposition to the sale is being driven by xenophobia and that there are no real national security or supply chain concerns. But on the other hand, you have former Trump U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who I'd argue is even more influential or would be in a future Trump administration, coming out strongly against the acquisition, saying that, of course, there's a national security issue. Also against the sale, the United Steelworkers, even though they came out against it, even though Nippon Steel promised to honor the steelworkers' current agreement with U.S. Steel, and that's an agreement that requires any buyer to come to terms on a new labor agreement prior to an acquisition. So, Jay, this sale sort of, or pending sale, kind of cuts across certain ideological lines. What do you think? Should it be allowed to go through? What do you make of the opposition to it? And do you think it's going to end up happening?
Well, no, and this is maybe unfair. I'm taking sort of a middle position on this. Is yes, anytime we're talking about big company that produces something that is vitally important to national security, I think caution is warranted, and you need to take a look at that, right? Are there the potentials of national security issues, you being able to produce enough steel if we need to, and supply chain issues? I think those are good conversations to have and important conversations to have. I would certainly feel differently if it was a Chinese company.
Yeah, great point.
Buying U.S. steel, right? I mean, obviously that's something entirely different. Or, to go back a couple of years, a Russian company buying all our uranium. But this otherwise, I think presumptively, right, should go through. And this is so. I'm not saying you don't take a look. I'm not saying you don't do the due diligence, and that the questions raised aren't important. But I think at the end of the day, we ought not to be xenophobic in terms of, if you can look at this a couple different ways. One is, well, it's the Japanese buying up our stuff. The other is our country being open for investment.
Yeah, and that was the case that Ross made. And I think you're right that this.
As you expect, I'm more a Wilbur Ross than I am a Robert Lighthizer kind of guy.
But when you look at just the basic facts of the industry, right? I mean, U.S. Steel has this sort of name, right, that people are very familiar with, but it's not even the largest U.S. steel manufacturer. That's Nucor, and they produce significantly more steel than U.S. Steel. And not only that, but the American steel industry is only operating at around 75% of capacity, and the idle capacity in the steel industry is greater than U.S. Steel's total output, which is an important thing to keep in mind. So even if, Nippon Steel just goes nuts and says, we are not allowing any Nippon Steel made to be sold, we have plenty of excess capacity in there. And
which would be a weird thing to do for a steel company.
Exactly. And so, but I think this is, a lot of people don't go that far. They just think, oh my God, Japan is buying up these foreigners are buying up our steel. And that's why and I know you share concerns, like when Donald Trump basically put a 25% tariff on nearly all imported steel. That's just a nutty thing to do.
That's rank protectionism.
And that doesn't help. I think you can make a really good argument that sort of protectionism that U.S. Steel and other American steel companies have been beneficiaries of for generations now has in part been part of the reason why they, in many instances, are not nearly as technologically advanced, because they were protected they didn't have to be that good and that advanced. And one of the big problems with U.S. Steel for a long time has been that its technology isn't anywhere near state of the art, and that's the whole argument for allowing foreign investment and competition, is that we want competition to force American companies to produce the best products in the world and not to just produce subpar, expensive products that we have to buy because they're American.
Yeah. So Mike, this is a great segue into our light blue collar Midwest past. But as some listeners know, I mean, I know a little bit about steel and a little bit about Japan, having grown up in Youngstown, Ohio, which was at one point the steel capital of the country, particularly during the 50s, early 60s. And you mentioned protectionism. There was also, the U.S. had sort of a natural protectionism that took place during those post-war decades, in that most of European and Japanese production had been wiped out by the war. We were sort of the only game in town, and there was a whole lot of steel that needed to be made as a post-war recovery, as the automobile boom, as spreading out, suburbanization, and all these things, right, that happened in the 50s and through the 60s. And I think you're exactly right that there was a complacency that sort of set in. And then you got to the mid 70s, and all of a sudden, the Europeans had built new plants. And again, many folks in places like Youngstown, Ohio said, yeah, and they built it with our aid, which is not untrue. And same with the Japanese, right? We helped build their capacity up better than, newer than what we had. But you had U.S. companies that just could not compete in making the same margins that they did before. And you and I were old enough to live through what was sort of the Japanic, we'll call it, of the 1980s, right? There was the fear that the Japanese were going to economically displace America. They were buying up lots of real estate. They bought Rockefeller Center, all this stuff that, that somehow now it's, Japanese will own everything. Nakatomi Plaza, right? I mean, there's those are all elements, right, of that 80s Japan thing. And of course, it didn't really come to pass because the Japanese economy subsequently sputtered in the 90s and into the early 2000s. But I can very much, remember being told in sixth grade, well, look, you guys all need to learn Japanese because, that's who you're going to be working for.
And previous to that, it was the Saudi Arabians, right, and in the 70s that concerned that they were going to buy up everything with their petrodollars, that kind of thing. And so apparently, I mean, they've succeeded. Yeah, good. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, I look at this is it's kind of nostalgic, but I don't see this tremendous concern with having the Japanese buy a company. Again, because of the commodity that's being made, I think there's naturally a national security interest, and it ought to be looked at carefully. But yeah, let's tell a story. My congressman, Jim Trafficant, back in the 80s,
oh god, would
have fundraisers where for $25 you could take a sledgehammer to a Toyota. This is literally what would happen, right? His fundraisers. So again, it's sort of funny, people talking now about Trump being xenophobic and so forth. We literally had Democratic congressmen hosting, these Japanese car bashing things where you would literally smash up Japanese cars. There were signs as you got close to the BMV, where you took your driver's test in Youngstown, Ohio, that all said Japanese cars steal American jobs. And if you took your driver's test in a Japanese car, you failed, period. I mean, on the second or third time you might get. I know of absolutely no one who ever took their test in a Japanese car and passed the first time. Never. And again, the signs are all around the state facility where you go to take your driver's test.
I remember growing up in Cleveland.
I'm not suggesting that the signs were put there by the state. The signs were put there by unions, but
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is important because it's not beyond the realm of possibility that this sale is delayed, the approval is delayed long enough, depending on how the opposition goes. And if it gets delayed into 2025 and Trump is reelected, I think if this has not been entirely approved before Donald Trump would start a second term, that almost certainly would be rejected because the committee that evaluates on foreign investment, it's basically all top cabinet officials. And I have a hard time believing that Donald Trump would allow this sale to go through. And so this is a big deal because this also, I should point out, it's a good thing because it allows that investment into the former U.S. Steel that will actually allow it to innovate and bring up its production standards and actually should create jobs and make steel made in this country better and more efficient. And that's win-win.
And this goes to my point too. And I made these arguments to my sixth grade teacher back in the day who was unsympathetic towards them. Who actually won because we did have a Japanese car. Asked me how I felt about putting other kids' parents out of work. But again, this is what I'm trying to say. If people are saying, "Oh my gosh, xenophobia, Japan," no, I lived it. Today, one of the largest employers in Ohio, in Central Ohio, is Honda of America, right? Japanese companies invested, built plants in America, and they're hiring Americans, and they're making good money, putting out good cars. So yeah, I am an old school Adam Smith kind of guy on this. And if anybody goes back and people say Adam Smith sort of invented capitalism and all that, but if you read A Wealth of Nations, mostly what it's about is free trade and sort of the idea that let the place, person, company, nation that can do something most efficiently do it, because that's going to be the best for all around. Yeah. So.
But of course, it was easier for the U.S. to be free trade when we didn't have any significant competition.
When you didn't have any competitors.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. All right, let's move on to, well, I guess it's not exactly trade related, but it's certainly economic related in some way. This, again, is from a couple weeks ago. The New York Times ended 2023 by filing a federal lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft, which has a pretty big stake in OpenAI, claiming that the two firms have committed copyright infringement on a grand scale, right? They say that OpenAI's LLM was built by copying and using millions of New York Times articles. And not only that, but that the model's builders gave particular emphasis to Times content, and they now use that content.
That's what troubles me.
Well, yeah, yeah, you'd be worried about that, sure. But basically the Times said we made this massive investment in journalism, built these journalistic products, and now OpenAI trained its model on this, and now it's spitting out these, in many cases, almost verbatim excerpts, detailed summaries. They're significantly longer. They're more detailed than anything that you get from a traditional search engine, and that they said they've tried to reach some sort of a negotiated agreement with OpenAI for the use of their content. They haven't been able to do so. Now, on their part, OpenAI and Microsoft say, hey, we're within our fair use rights because our product is transformative in nature, meaning that it creates something new.
Right.
That
you're not just copying something, you're making something new.
Exactly. So now that is not a flat out defense, but if you can prove that your work is transformative, that makes it more likely that your work will be ruled as being within fair use standards. But it's not the only standard. I want to point that out. Now, but the Times says it's not even transformative because basically the product that results is in fact a substitute for those copyright articles, and that it directly competes with and mimics.
Like Claudine Gay cutting and pasting.
Nice. There you go. Now, what the Times says in their lawsuit is that they're entitled to billions of dollars in statutory and actual damages. They want OpenAI and Microsoft to be enjoined from using their material, and that any LLMs that have used their material should be destroyed, in the words of the lawsuit. Now, kind of more broadly, the publishing world understandably is concerned with the threat from these LLMs. And there are some actually, like the Times, Getty Images as well, have pursued litigation, but there are others that have taken a different course. For instance, the Associated Press reached a licensing agreement not too long ago with OpenAI. Now, we don't know about the terms. These weren't publicly disclosed, but we do know that we're told it includes what's called a most favored nation clause, or that's what it's called sometimes, which means that the AP has a right to reset the terms of the agreement if any other company gets a better deal than AP for the use of their content. So we see some differences in approach here. And I guess I want to get your take on that, but specifically on this lawsuit, I wonder what kind of a legal case you think the New York Times might have, and then we can get into maybe the more general threat to journalism posed by these LLMs. What do you think? Wait, before you go, I've got some news for you. While that is it for the free preview of this Supporters Midweek episode, there is a lot more, and you can hear it all every week by becoming a supporter. Now, normally that means $5 a month or more, but for the rest of January, we're cutting that in half, just $2.50 a month for not just the full midweek episode, but ad-free versions of everything we release and access to our always lively, often provocative, and, occasionally even kind of wise Politics Guys Discord group. and you will lock in that access at $250 a month for the entire year of 2024 with everything that's going to be going on. I think it's an awesome deal. But if $250 a month is just too much, how about free? That's right. If you are not in a position to financially support the podcast, but you would like to get the full midweek episode, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make sure that every week you get a link to that full midweek supporters episode. To check it out, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can just check it out in the show notes. I always have the link there, or at politicsguys.com/support. And before I go, as always, a special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Brian Beasley, and Don Oglesby.